What up, y'all? I'm Summer. This is the shop. Let's talk reptiles. So this video is going to be uncut. I want to have a conversation about the ethics of reptile shows. Let's get into it. So I understand on some level the necessity for them, the appeal of them, but I cannot help but to see the other side of the situation and problems related to reptile shows that are like crying, screaming out for some type of resolution. I don't know. I haven't done an uncut video before, so I'm going to try my best to talk about this as fluidly as I possibly can. I don't know. Anyway, let's get into it. So I want to love reptile shows so much. On the good side of it, like, I get to experience so many cool animals that I personally don't keep. For me, I love lizards. That's where my interest lies. I work with uromastyx, a couple of different species, with bearded dragons, couple of different species, and then panther chameleons, a couple of different locales. Like, that's where my interest lies. I started out with panther chameleons. I was really drawn in by their beautiful color and the complexity of their care. I was really drawn in by that. And it all just kind of, you know how it goes. It all just kind of exploded from that point. Right. And so those are the animals that I have, that I keep, that I spend my time with, caring for daily. So going to reptile shows is super fun on that level. Like, I get to see all of these cool different types of snakes. It also depends on how much biodiversity is present at those shows, because sometimes that's not the case. I recently went to a local reptile show not that far from my home in the Bay Area, and for the most part it was all ball pythons and geckos, mainly crested geckos. And there were some others, like there were some like gargoyle geckos, which was cool. And then there were like bearded dragons there, of course, but only a few booths and like a couple of booths of chameleon keepers. But the mass majority of the folks there were ball pythons and crested geckos. But like going to shows like the Reptile Super Show was pretty cool, because I saw so many different really cool species, like animals I'd never seen in person before, like Gila monsters and just like false water cobra, like just all kinds of cool things. And it really blew my mind, right? And it's also really cool walking around the show and seeing the number of kids and families that are there. A lot of times it's folks who don't even have reptiles. They're just like, oh, this is like a cool thing I can go do with my family. Let me like gather up the kids and go check. Is my sweater's on backwards. Anyway, so like go gather up the kids and go to the show and check it out. And it's really cool to see their awesome little faces as they get excited about animals they never even knew existed, and watching their minds open up, right? So there's definitely good there. There's like being able to experience things that you don't get to experience normally, and being able to develop an appreciation for an animal that you don't get to appreciate on a regular basis. Like it's pretty cool in that aspect. And then also there's the economic aspect of it. A lot of folks that are breeders, regardless of the level, small to big, they get an opportunity to make major economic impact for their companies, and whether they're full-time or part-time, right? So that's some of the good aspects that I see. If you guys see other things, like, please drop it in the chat. Like, let's talk about this. But there's the downsides that I cannot ignore. And one of the things that comes to mind for me every time I go to a reptile show is this feels inhumane. It visually, on like a perception level, it looks inhumane. It comes across as inhumane for these animals. And it really makes me question the ethics of those spaces. Now, I don't want to get people, whoever watches this video, up in a uproar. I'm not saying that reptile shows shouldn't exist. Like, that's not at all the standpoint I'm coming from. In fact, I think that they are a vital part and an important part of our community. But we need to have conversations about the ways that we do these things, right? Folks are having conversations about what's the best way for us to care for our animals. Is it ethical to keep in racks? Is it ethical to ignore certain needs of the animals that we interact with and that we have made decisions to bring into our spaces, into our lives, into our homes? Like, we're having conversations around this. And so I think having a conversation, multiple conversations, however many people are bringing up this topic, because the more we talk about it, the better. But I think having conversations around the ethics of shows is really important as well, right? All right, so let's keep it going. So yeah, I can't ignore like the perception of it, right? We have a lot of folks that are coming in that aren't necessarily reptile keepers, and their families that are coming in checking out reptiles for the first time, and they're seeing us put animals in deli cups, in food containers. I saw a snake at this last show that I went to that was in a deli cup that it literally was filling the deli cup. I am not exaggerating to you. The cup, it was like the container was about that big, and the snake, like vertically, laterally, completely filling that container, could not move. I saw an instance of, and this was with the same vendor, with blue-tongued skinks that were in, again, super tiny containers where their bodies had to curl around the shape of the container in order for them to fit in there, right? So we have people coming in from the public, and they see these things, folks who aren't knowledgeable, folks that may not have done, let's be honest, we're going to also talk about like the way that reptile shows promote impulse buying in a second. But folks that are coming in from the streets, they see these animals and are like, oh, I want this thing. And they say, buy this big snake that's in this small container. And they get the limited information that they may receive from that individual vendor. And then they go home and put it in, like, I don't know, a 40-gallon aquarium or something that's clearly not appropriate for the size of that animal. And so it's like we are giving the impression to the public that the ways that we are keeping these animals in this show setting is in any way, shape, or form potentially okay for the care of that animal, right? And like, I'm not naive. I understand that everyone at these shows, you have a limited space with your table. So you can't necessarily have like some full size setup for every animal that you're keeping. But why not have like 2 or 3 like display enclosures for each of the species, like one display enclosure for each of the animals that you're keeping that is set up correctly and accurately to the care of that particular animal. As folks that are breeding animals, it is our responsibility to make sure that those animals are going to places where their care is going to be the highest that that person can possibly provide, that it's meeting all of the needs of that animal. So I think it's a small ask to say, why not require for vendors at shows to have for whatever number of species that they're selling, they have a full-size setup that shows the care of what that animal needs to receive. And if it's not a full-size setup, then having it on display in some other kind of way. Maybe it's a big image that has dimensions that shows this is what this animal needs for correct care, so that even when people are just walking by, they can see that information, take it in, absorb that information, and say, oh, like I have a clear understanding, or a clearer understanding between this is a temporary situation and this animal should be in something way more advanced, way more all-encompassing than what I'm looking at this show, right? And like, before folks say like, oh, it's common sense, folks should know this, like we've all overheard talk at shows, and I've definitely heard people say stuff like, man, like I wonder what it's like to live in a little like setup like that. Right. So I like, we've all heard people overheard conversations at shows, and I've definitely heard people have the impression that this is what's okay. Like this is like how this animal should be living, because this is what I'm seeing from someone that I'm viewing on some level as a professional with this particular animal that I know nothing about. Right. So that's one of the things that like one of the big things that I think is a problem that needs to really be addressed in the ways that reptile shows are executed. The next thing I see is that reptile shows really do support and promote impulse buying. And in an industry where overall so many people like preach the gospel of do not impulse buy a reptile. You need to make sure that you understand how to care for that animal before you bring that animal home, right? You should already have your enclosure set up before you bring that animal home. I came into reptile keeping through the subgroup of chameleon keepers, and it was kind of like a skewed introduction to this space, because chameleon keepers do overall, I think, a better job of making sure that the folks that are buying this animal, that they're prepared to care for that animal properly. Every chameleon that I have a number of them, the breeder asks, like, I need to see pictures of your setup. Can you explain to me how you're going to work with your UV lighting? What kind of UV lighting are you going to have? Can you explain to me the heating in your setup? Can you tell me about supplementation? Like, I was asked these questions for the majority of the animals that I purchased, some of them more detailed than others, but the breeders were like, you need to show me that you know what you're doing before we can complete this purchase, right? And then I went the complete opposite in of bearded dragons, and I have a number of bearded dragons, and not one bearded dragon breeder, not one of them asked me anything about care requirements. No one asked if I had an enclosure set up ahead of time. No one asked about my knowledge around keeping arid animals, UV, nothing. No one asked a single question. And in fact, I've had some breeders, I had one breeder in particular that I asked them, like, okay, I need to get the enclosure and everything set up. Can you hold them for a week? And their response was, we don't hold animals. So it was like night and day coming from the chameleon world into the bearded dragon world, and like moving into the Uromastic world as well. It's like that amount of like scrutiny isn't present. Like, no one asked me those questions, and it was honestly a bit troubling and a little bit disturbing, you know? So like reptile shows, they promote impulse buying, because folks are in there, you see these animals, you get so excited and you're like, oh, it's so cool, I really want that, and then you buy it and then you don't really understand what to do with it. I was at a different reptile show and I saw someone had just bought a veiled chameleon, and no, it was a panther chameleon. Someone had bought a panther chameleon, and like from one vendor, and then they were talking to a different vendor and they were like, hey, can you tell me like what to do with this animal? And I was like blown away, and that other vendor was like, I'm sorry, man, I'm just a representative. I honestly, I really don't even know, and we don't sell those kinds of animals. That was the honest response from the person that they asked at another table. They were like, I don't really know how to care for these animals that we have here. I'm just here for someone else as a representative. So I stopped and I talked to him, and I was like, look, I'm going to give you a rundown of the things that you need right now, that you need to go home with right now to take care of this animal. And I gave them like a rundown list of things, and it's like, oh, well, the person at the other table, and I told them, like, don't get the chameleon kit. It is going to come with things that are going to confuse you. It's going to contradict the things that I'm saying to you right now, and that enclosure is too small. And he's like, oh, well, the person I bought it from just told me go over there and pick up a chameleon kit. And I'm like, no, don't do that. So I gave this person as much information as I possibly could about how to care for this animal, and I directed them to the Chameleon forums and to Chameleon Academy website. Who knows what really happened after that, right? So there is this impulse to buy because you see these animals, and vendors at the end of the day, like, they want to make their money back for what they paid for that booth. And like, no vendor goes to a reptile show hoping not to sell their animals, so like, I'm going to make a sweeping assumption that a lot of vendors that are at the show, their primary goal is to like make sure that they move their animals, right? And there are some vendors there who are like putting the care and the interests of their animals first. But I've purchased animals at reptile shows from folks that I researched ahead of time. And those folks, none of them asked me anything about my knowledge around care for those specific animals and those species. Right? Even though I know that those people individually, because I researched them ahead of time, those people individually are reputable people working with these animals, right? So that's an issue, like around impulse buying and folks going home with animals and not properly caring for them. One vendor that I purchased from at the Reptile Super Show had a horrible experience. They had basilisk and this person bought 2 from them, and before the day was even out, came back and was like, hey man, those animals died in my car. Can I get my money back? Right? Like, those animals didn't even last 24 hours in the care of that person because they didn't even know enough not to leave those animals to reptile lives, not to leave them in a car, and they baked and died. Like, and also, maybe they weren't even dead. Like, not all of us have experience with this, but some of us may. Like, a reptile may have an accident or be in a dire situation where you look at that animal and you think that animal is dead. There's no signs of life, when in actually they are shutting their bodies down to the bare minimum so that they could potentially survive this life-threatening situation. So maybe they weren't even dead, but this person didn't know enough about reptiles to even recognize that, one, were they actually dead? And 2, do not leave them in that type of situation. And the disconnect is interesting to me because, common sense, you don't leave like a toddler in a car, a baby in a car. Like there's just like, you don't leave things in cars that are living because it could kill them, especially in Southern California in the summertime heat, you know? So yeah, like impulse buying is one of the big ones, I think, that needs to be addressed in some way. And I know it's a big thing to tackle. Like, how do you vet folks ahead of time? And then there's always going to be folks that are just walking in day of, like, without like any like knowledge or information. And like, so it's like, what do? Like, do you turn away sales? Like, that's a difficult push. Yeah, like what does that look like, right? So I think about these things in relation to like these reptile shows and the ethics behind them, and the way that it kind of turns into us commodifying these animals to a point where we're not even looking at them as living sentient creatures, because that's what they are. They're living sentient beings. And at reptile shows, they kind of become objectified, where we're looking at them no different from like a thing that has no pulse, no blood, no mental capacity. And we try to move them in that way. Even like the mindset of some conversations I hear, like, oh, we're moving animals, I moved so many animals this weekend. Like, it's like even the language around it is a bit problematic, right? At this reptile show I went to last weekend, I overheard a guy looking at some bearded dragons, and these bearded dragons were priced at $90 each. And this guy was like, $90 for a bearded dragon? Oh my God, man, we need to start breeding these things. Like back in the day, you were getting them for like $50, and now they're $90. Is they would have like 300 of them. Man, that's easy money. So this is what this guy was saying. And of course, we can't avoid folks that are going to look at these animals as a payday. And there are lots of folks there are folks who are in the industry right now that only look at them as a payday. And let's be realistic, like folks that are working with these animals are developing a business, like a business structure. You're working with them as a business structure. And the point of a business, one of the points of those businesses is to make money. It has to be a part of it. Like, you have to balance working with the animals and you have to make money, or it won't work. It won't survive. So I'm not saying that making money with your reptiles is bad. In fact, I do not think that's bad at all. But when they're commodified to the point where they're only seen as dollar signs, then that becomes a huge issue. And that's one of the things that can happen within a reptile show. Like, I don't think that is the fault of the individual breeders. I think that is a systemic problem overall, and having more points of education throughout the show could maybe help lessen the effects of that. And by education, I mean education about the individual animals, education about what goes into the care for these individual animals, so that a person like that can understand, like, oh, that's not pure $90 profit. Like, this animal needs care. You need to feed it. Bugs are expensive. Those bugs need to be properly gut loaded and supplemented. It takes a lot of time. You need to clean up behind them. That takes like time and effort. Their environment needs to be clean. Baby dragons need to be soaked, and that's time and effort. So like, more education around what it takes to care for these individual animals, like just throughout the show. And I think that's a responsibility that the folks that are putting on the show should take on to themselves, to make sure that they are putting up educational content in very visible ways, so that show goers can have access to that information. Right? So The other thing that I think, and this may be my last point, this is the thing, the last strong point that's coming up for me, is the health of the animals at the shows. Now, there are some shows that do a good job of having a vet that they are employing that walks around continuously checking the health, the condition, the care of the animals, telling vendors you need to pull that animal's not in good condition, that animal's not healthy. So there are some folks that do these things, but not all shows do this because there's no requirement around those types of things. And like just in general, there's very little to no regulation around how we keep and care for reptiles anyway. So there's really like no push around like having like this is a requirement. You need to have vets of at least one vet, depending on the size of the show, on hand, whose job is to check all the animals, walk around, give them a look over, make sure that they are actually healthy enough to go live in another home. Because like how heartbreaking is it for someone to buy their first family bearded dragon, and then they bring that animal home, and then that animal like deteriorates and dies, and then someone's kid has to witness that happen, right? This last show I went to, there was one particular vendor, multiple vendors I'm going to talk about in terms of the health of their animals, but there was one particular vendor who had bearded dragons, and they were in despicable condition. They were clearly underfed. The hip bones around their tail were completely visible. They weren't displayed with any heat, so all of them were in various states of being lethargic. And this was all the dragons they had on display, from like adults to the babies. Like all of them were clearly being neglected in terms of care, in terms of nutrition, and being fed the amount that they needed to be fed to be healthy, strong animals. And they were sitting there at $200, $300, $400, $500 price points, a table full of sick animals. Another vendor had like 3 cages full to the brim of chameleons, and all of them were darkly colored because they weren't getting enough heat. Some of them were sleeping, some of them were fighting with each other. I mean, it was again, despicable amount of animals in those enclosures. And what made it even worse was they were set up next to another chameleon vendor that had the complete opposite setups for their animals. That vendor had full-size setups where a person could see, oh, this is the proper care for this, the proper setup, or a similar proper setup for this animal. And then all of their individual chameleons that were for sale were individually in pretty nice size critter keepers, complete like night and day. And I'm not saying that setup was perfect, but man, oh man, it was night and day, like head, shoulders, knees, and toes above what that other keeper had set up there, right? And I was looking at those chameleons and I was thinking, if someone takes one of these chameleons home, they are going to really need to know what they're doing in order to make sure that that animal survives. Like, they're not going to be able to make any mistakes. Mistakes that just like the typical first time keeper may make, especially with an animal like chameleons. Now, I know folks say like chameleons are so sensitive and there's zero room for error. That's not true. I have found chameleons to be quite hardy. Panther chameleons specifically, veiled chameleons are super hardy, but panther chameleons, I have found them to be pretty hardy. You just have to get it like mostly right, almost all like mostly right. And like I have made mistakes along the way. Like a panther chameleon was my first reptile, and I had done so much research ahead of time, but there were things that I was still understanding. Theoretical understanding is way different from like actual like feet on the ground, I am doing this understanding, right? So there were things I had to catch up on, getting my heating, my temperatures like dialed in correctly, getting my humidity dialed in like perfectly, airflow, like all those things. So I did make a few mistakes along the way as I learned and improved my husbandry for my animals. So they're hardier than they seem, but when they're coming from a situation like that, where they are going to spend their like multiple days in this enclosure completely stressed out to the maximum level because there's people staring at them, there's all of these other animals crawling all over them, they don't have proper access to the resources that they need, like UVB lighting and heat, and they were in there with just like crickets by the buttload. So potentially also getting bitten by these crickets and these animals, and also not getting enough food. Baby chameleons need a lot of food, like all baby creatures, right? So the health of the animals in some shows is not put on the level of emphasis that it needs to be. And folks come in, they see these animals, they see the level of care, and I think folks walk away with a misunderstanding of what these animals need. And like I've heard other people make this point as well, is like, as a hobby, as like a business, as an industry, like we make ourselves easy targets with the way that things are ran at reptile shows. We really do. For folks that are like, this should not be happening, you should not keep these animals, no one should be allowed to do this, you should not be allowed to have these animals in your care or in your home. Like reptile shows make easy target for folks that are like, oh, like this is what these people do to these animals. And it's not a fair representation of how caring and loving and thoughtful and just giving folks, some folks not, and I do acknowledge not all folks, some folks are with their animals, and how like caring and giving some breeders are with their animals and not treating them as like commodities, you know? So I think there's a lot to unwrap there and a lot to talk about there. And I think like making standards, folks that are running reptile shows, especially the big ones, because this would have to start with the big ones, right? Like if I were to start a new reptile show and then I have all these standards in place, like maybe vendors won't want to participate because they won't want to adhere to the standards that I'm asking them to adhere to. But if someone big, like say the Reptile Super Show, where folks are flocking to every year, if they were to say, these are the new standards that we are putting in place in terms of how you can display these animals, the information that you are required to provide about the care of these animals, signage that you are required to put up. If someone big like them did that, then the trickle down effect would make it a lot more possible for smaller local shows to do the same thing. Now, if someone's running a smaller local show and like they're like established and they're kind of one of the few options available to breeders, then it can make it a lot easier for those local shows to like really think critically about the things that they are putting in place and the requirements that they're putting on folks that are participating in the shows, right? It would make it a lot easier for them to put those standards in place for sure. But like, I think if the big guys start really considering the things and the ways that they do things, like the Tinleys of the world, the Reptile Super Shows of the world, the NARBs of the world, like that would, I think, really have sweeping trickle down positive effects for the industry as a whole, because then individuals walking into the show will get a different impression of what proper care looks like, and that can hopefully transform the way that they think about caring for these animals that they're bringing into their spaces, right? So those are some of the thoughts I have around that topic. And I just like, I love my reptiles. I love like this reptile family that I'm a part of. I even love the side hobbies I end up having because of my reptiles, like keeping invertebrates and roaches. And yeah, these things that my partner probably doesn't love that I do, like having bins of roaches in our garage, like things of that nature. But like, I really do wholeheartedly love what I do here, and it brings me a lot of joy. Like, I come home from a day at work that may be frustrating. I work in education, and I work in higher education, and the systems within that space can be really frustrating and really hard to change. And I come home to like a baby Uromastic, or my adult Uromastics, or my bearded dragons, or I go sit with my chameleons in their outdoor space, and it just completely washes away the day, any frustrations, the stress. They're like amazing emotional support friends, like hands down, you know. And if I was coming to a space and my animals, their setups were crappy, like I wasn't doing a proper job of cleaning them, I wasn't giving them proper care, then it would be an even higher stressor for me. So caring for my animals properly is a part of what makes doing this and participating, making the choice to participate in this space. It is a part of what makes, like, properly caring for my animal is a part of what makes this pleasurable and makes it an enjoyable thing for me to do, right? So yeah, that's all I got. I just ask that folks think about it. If you have thoughts, you 100% disagree, whatever it is, like you agree, if you've thought about these same things, like talk about it in the comments. Like, let's have this conversation. Let's chat about it. Let's talk about what could be different, what should be different, and what accountability we should be taking on as folks that are choosing to participate in this particular like area of like life and nature and animals, you know. Yeah, if you liked it, please tap that like button, give me a subscribe, ring that bell so you know when I post more videos. And yeah, I want us to have more of these conversations more frequently, because brushing something under a table, ignoring it, not talking about it is how things continue to spiral out of control. All right, y'all, I'm out.